Turning to the book of Job, we'll first take a brief look in broad terms at what's in the book. First two chapters are a prose introduction to the book. Chapters 3 to 31 is the main poem. Job is comforted, in inverted commas, by his three friends Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar. Although there is an interruption in this, chapter 28 is a hymn to wisdom, seems not to belong to the poem at all, although it shares a lot of ideas about wisdom. Then chapters 32 to 37 are an additional poem in which a younger friend, Elihu, adds his advice. This poem has its own brief prose introduction. 38 to 42 verse 6, the main poem resumes with the Lord speaking to Job, and at the very end there's a prose epilogue. Where does it come from? Well, hardly any commentators think that the main poem was written by the same person as the prose introduction. I mean, the main poem is high literature, the prose isn't. The main poem presupposes some such story as is told in the introduction, so it's probably best to think of the intro or some version of it as existing well before the poem. The main poem, although it's telling of the troubles of this character called Job, comes over as if those troubles have been experienced by the poet himself, while the prose introduction is clearly a third-party account. So we'll assume that the intro existed before the poem, although it's possible that it was edited a bit to make it work better as an intro. It seems that the additional poem with Elihu is also by someone else, an addition to the poem presumably by someone who thought they had something to add and the wherewithal to add it, and most people think they were wrong on both counts. The Hebrew language of the main poem has a number of words and turns of phrase which connect it with Arabic, which would mean that its most likely province would be during the exile in Babylon. The Hebrew of the Elihu chapters is full of echoes of Aramaic, the language spoken in Israel in the centuries leading up to Jesus. So that means that it almost certainly comes from that period, probably generations later than the main poem. So our assumption is this. The main poem, which deserves most of our attention, was by a suffering genius, most likely during the exile, which is a period of a lot of writing anyway. The prose intro and the epilogue must have existed before that poem, either in written or in oral form. And the Elihu chapters are from a later, inferior author. I've got an experiment or exercise, whatever you want to call it, for you. I'd like you to read, please, the first 10 verses of chapter 3 of Job. And this surely suggests that the poet, as well as Job, knew the sort of sufferings that is mentioned here. And once you've read that, go to Jeremiah chapter 20 and read verses 14 to 18. I've got a question or two for you when you've read them. So here's the first question. If you were to suppose that one of these two pieces was written first, and that the other was written knowing the first, which way round would you put them? Well, most people would assume that Jeremiah was first. It's simpler, it's less crafted than Job, and the dependent passage is more likely to be elaborating rather than simplifying. And I think that if Jeremiah knew Job, I reckon there would be plenty more in the Job chapter that Jeremiah would have plundered for the bit that he wrote. Well, Jeremiah was written in Jerusalem and or Egypt around the very beginning of the exile, and the study of the Hebrew of Job suggests that it was written during the exile, so that fits. Let's have another exercise. This only requires you to review one Bible passage, and it's the fourth of the four servant songs in Isaiah, starting at the last verse of chapter 52 and going through the whole of chapter 53. This is the other great poem on suffering. I've got an argument to put to you when you've read it. I've got an argument from silence. It is that there's nothing in Job which in any way moves over into the territory of Isaiah 53, where the suffering of the Lord's servant is seen as achieving something for other people, vicarious suffering, as they call it. Now, the second part of Isaiah clearly comes from the end of the 70 years of exile, and the argument from silence is that if Isaiah 53 had been already current in the exiled community when Job was written, surely it would have found some sort of echo in Job. It's got more interesting stuff to say about the business of suffering than Job has. And that again suggests that Job was written during the exile, before, that is, the very end of the exile, when the second part of Isaiah is found. Let's give a little bit of attention to the prose intro. It's not a great work of literature like the main poem, but there are a couple of elements in it which do deserve our attention. The first is the mention of the Satan, usually very unhelpfully translated in English versions just as Satan. We are here some long way short of the New Testament picture of God's arch opponent, the devil, having Satan as one of his names. The Satan means the accuser, and if you read the story, you find him playing the role that we would call of devil's advocate, rather than of the devil himself. And the other thing to pay attention to in this prose intro is the idea that Job was 100% innocent. We, of course, are committed to the view that only Jesus has ever been totally sinless, which strongly suggests that the sinlessness of Job is a deliberate exaggeration. There is very probably some extremely virtuous man whose life and suffering lie behind the story. But the real point of the story is that it's a hypothesis. Let's suppose that there was once a very godly and totally sinless man who, for reasons totally unrelated to his own behaviour, fell into the most awful suffering and tragedy. What would he then make of his faith in a good and just God? The poem is a what-if exercise. You understand that no Hebrew mind would possibly have put the ideas in the way that I just have done, and the Hebrew language is not really adept at expressing that sort of hypothesizing. What you can do in Hebrew is to tell a story which raises those issues. That's what's going on in Job. In any other culture you might find it rather expressed as a philosophical dialogue. In Hebrew it has to be related as if it's the actual sufferings of an actually innocent man. And that's the way that the Hebrew language and the Hebrew culture worked with an exploration like this. Well, we'll leave it there for the moment, and then we'll resume with the main poem when you're ready. Before we look at the main poem, I want to introduce an idea to you. The composer Joseph Haydn was the greatest and most prolific composer of string quartets. He wrote some 80-odd of them. One quartet stands out from the others as a quite different piece, and that's his 7 Last Words of Jesus Christ, a piece designed to punctuate Good Friday devotions. As well as a movement to accompany each of the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross, there is an intro and a finale. The finale is quite brisk, but all the other 8 movements are slow. And for most composers, 8 slow movements following each other would get very tedious and find the composer running out of ideas that could work without being broken up with something a little bit more jolly. But Haydn's work is absolutely brilliant. There's no sense of his being anywhere near the limit of what he has to say in a sequence of slow movements. And the speeches in Job remind me of that quartet. Every single one of them has Job expressing his pain, his depression, his puzzlement, his desire that his troubles should come to an end, by death if necessary, his desire for the Lord and to find out the meaning of what's happening to him. And all these chapters are so similar to each other, and yet they keep going. They've shown every sign of stopping only because the Lord eventually tells Job to shut up. It might be possible at a very advanced level of studying of Job to arrange the dialogue so that you could see a progression of thought from chapter to chapter. I'm not going to attempt that. I'm not even going to attempt to separate out for you the three contributions of the friends. I'm going to take you through some of the themes of Job's speeches and then look at the sorts of things that the three friends said in reply. We've already seen in Job 3 his complaining that he was ever born. Let's look at chapter 6, verses 8 to 10. Job is not desperate enough to commit suicide, but he does wish that the Lord would relieve him of the need to do that and put an end to his life for him. This would have the twin effect of ending his misery and stopping his life before his reaction to his suffering leads him into sin. Still in chapter 6, verses 24 and 25. Job is willing to be taught what he needs to know to be able to grasp the meaning of his sufferings. But what his friends have so far contributed simply doesn't ring true, so it's of no help. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 13. Job is convinced of the greatness of God. That's an understatement. Although the force of the story is that Job was innocent of sin, he appreciates in verse 2 that laying claim to innocence before God is a waste of time. What, after all, is the greatest of human virtue compared with the Lord? Chapter 10, verses 18 to 22. This is not just bemoaning his lot. Job actually wants to know the answer as to what his life is about. Why then? Before his sufferings began, he thought he knew the answer, but nothing he then took as truth has survived the test of his sufferings. He must find a deeper answer now, or he will go mad. Chapter 12, verses 4 to 10. Job might not be able to grasp the whys and wherefores, but he's convinced that good and ill come to different people because the Lord sends them. Chapter 13, verse 3. His greatest desire right at this moment is to be able to dialogue with God, not necessarily to defend his own innocence, but to find out what it all means. And in verse 4, his friends, however, are not helping at all. They're like physicians putting ointment on his wounds, but their ointment consists only of statements which are simply not true. Look at chapter 14, the first 6 verses. This is rather like those psalms which David or whoever is addressing his complaints directly to the Lord. Then the next few verses, 7 to 10 in chapter 14, if there is any meaning in someone's life, that meaning has to be brought to light before that person dies, because there is nothing after his death. The notion of resurrection had not yet at this stage found its way into Hebrew thought. At least a dying tree can have some meaning, in that it almost automatically gives rise to a new shoot. But there's no such consolation for a human who has died. They're finished, and if the meaning of their life has not at that point emerged, then it's too late. Chapter 16, verse 18. Job hopes that even though he won't live on, the issues raised by his life will persist, and perhaps someone else will resolve them. Makes you wonder whether that could be Jesus, but that's a different story. Verses 25 and 26 from chapter 19. 19, 25 and 26. It's not possible to read Job without paying some attention to these two verses. They're made so famous by Handel in his setting in Messiah. The fact is that the Hebrew is so difficult to translate that it's virtually impossible to say what these verses mean. We've already seen that Job has dismissed any sort of experience of life beyond death, and my guess is that the present form of these verses is down to some later editor who corrected the original in the sense of making it say something that the editor himself believed. So however much these verses express our faith, it would seem unlikely that Job shared that faith with us. Chapter 21, verses 7 to 16. Why do the wicked prosper? That's not envy on Job's part. It's one necessary element in his effort to grasp the meaning of his own life. If he can't understand why the wicked prosper, then he hasn't a chance to understand why he, an innocent man, is suffering so greatly. These are the two sides of the same issue. 23, verses 3 to 7. Job's search for meaning cannot be fulfilled by the conventional religion coming from his three friends. It can only come if he's at some point able to stand before the Lord and hear it from him. 23 verses 8 and 9. But Job simply isn't able to get in touch with the Lord in order to be able to hear from him. It's as if the Lord is hiding from him. And then in verses 10 to 12, his desire to come before the Lord is undergirded with a conviction that his innocence is clearly known to the Lord, and that the Lord will deal with him in the light of his innocence. 24, verse 1, you could read more of the chapter, but verse 1 will do. The world is full of wickedness and oppression, and it's a real problem for one who believes in a just and all-knowing God, that God does not seem to be doing anything about it. 26, verses 2 to 4, Job is so fed up with all the meaningless drivel coming from his friends that he resorts to bitter irony. 29, 1 to 6, Job looks back with longing to the days when his life made sense, when his faith in the Lord seemed to work, and he thought he had a meaningful grip on his own life. But now all that's gone, and he no longer knows what it's all about. In the early years of our marriage, when our two oldest children were very small, I thought I knew what I was doing. I even ran classes for newlyweds, telling them how to handle their marriage and their children. Since then, life has got an awful lot more complicated. Stress levels have more than once gone through the roof, and I no longer have that sort of reassuring confidence that I know what I'm doing. And that's how life goes for many people. It doesn't mean to say that I've gone dreadfully wrong. Perhaps it just means that I've lost my innocence which is made up in some part of ignorance. You might have a similar story to tell or to observe in Christians around you. Innocence and joy in the days following their conversion. Later on, they're more conscious of the business of taking up their cross daily in order to follow the Lord. Classically, Christian mystics have spoken of the dark night of the soul, a period through which Christians can go, in which both your thinking and your emotions give you no reassurance. You can no longer put words together which convincingly express any meaning in what's happening to you. The emotions of joy and peace have left you and been replaced by something much more uncomfortable. This seems to be pretty much what's happening to Job, but writ large. In the final chapters of his speeches, 30 to 31, he's not only proclaiming his innocence, but also saying that if anyone can demonstrate that he's not as innocent as he thinks he is, that will explain everything. But remember, at least as far as the poem is concerned, Job is an imaginary character who is 100% sinless, so that kind of satisfaction is not going to come his way. Well, before we look at the Lord's response to this, we must see the sorts of contributions that the three friends make. In brief, you can say that they're presenting him with the responses of conventional religion and conventional wisdom. Chapter 4, verses 3 to 6. Eliphaz says that someone who has been so famously pious throughout his life ought really to be able to maintain his piety in a time of trouble. In other words, Job, buck up your ideas. This kind of response can only come from someone who's lived a relatively boring life, for whom the conventional answers have seemed to work. He doesn't appreciate that Job has been there, but has now gone further on and needs something in addition to conventional piety. Chapter 5, verse 17. We ought to accept the Lord's discipline and manage sufficient holiness to be grateful for it. But Eliphaz, who says this, doesn't realise that he's speaking to someone who's far bigger than he is, who's been there, done that, bought the T-shirt, and who's now facing a far more thoroughgoing challenge. Chapter 5 still, verses 18 and 19. The nice thing about the Lord disciplining you is that he does it as one who loves you and will be sure to pick you up afterwards. It sounds very neat and very godly counsel, but it's not making contact with Job. Chapter 8, verses 8 to 10. Bildad expects Job to be able to find all that he needs in the collected wisdom of the ages. But Job feels that his experience is leading edge. No one's been there before. Chapter 11, 13 to 15. Zophar assumes that Job's troubles are a sure indication that he's done something wrong to deserve such suffering. Surely the notion of a just God demands such logic. So he tells Job to make proper confession of his sins and everything will be okay. That sounds to me a whole lot like those who deal with people's unanswered prayers by saying that they obviously didn't have enough faith when they prayed. God always answers prayers, so you must have done something wrong. Eliphaz has more of the same. Chapter 22, verses 21 to 26. It sounds so great. But what the friends won't realise is that in his very complaining, Job is taking himself in front of the Lord, but has not yet received any sort of response from the Lord. Conventional religion can't handle the sort of uncomfortable way in which Job is expressing himself to God, and it has to conclude that he isn't approaching God properly. In fact, he's making a more genuine approach to the Lord than do most adherents of the world's religions. Well, let's move to the last chapters, where at chapter 38, the main poem resumes with the Lord speaking to Job. 38 and 39 have the Lord pointing out that although Job believes that the Lord was the one who set the constellations in place, that's different from Job having been there when the Lord did it. He has a belief about it, but he doesn't share the power and authority which actually did it. In other words, Job, shut up. Beginning of chapter 40, verses 3 to 5, Job says he will shut up. And the Lord's speech then continues with more of the same, but notice verse 8 in chapter 40. Whatever your experience of suffering, will you bring in evidence to say that the Lord is not just? When you're going through the dark night of the soul, you don't survive it by the workings of your reason, and certainly not by what your emotions are doing to you. You survive it quite simply by an act of your will, and no less than that is required of Job. 42, 1 to 6. Now that Job has a more direct experience of the Lord, he's able to put his searchings for meaning into a better context. And the result is he does now have something to repent of. In the third section of our work on Job, I want to look at the result of Job's searchings. Did Job's questions get answered? Well, on an intellectual level, certainly not. Being told to shut up may restore good order, but it doesn't provide words and ideas to answer your questions. But on an existential level, his questioning was answered. He entered into a renewed trust in the Lord, which made it possible for him to continue, despite the lack of an intellectual grasp of the answers to his questions. Perhaps in the light of that renewed experience of the Lord, even some of the friend's conventional answers might now work again. When we face the same issues today, there is, of course, one huge difference from the position that Job occupied. That is, of course, that since the poem was written, the Lord Jesus Christ has suffered for us in order to bring us to God in a new way. Not only did the second part of Isaiah develop the idea of vicarious suffering, but in Jesus it actually happened and makes a total difference to us. So these days, when anyone asks the question about why the wicked prosper or why the innocent suffer, I don't feel you can answer the question properly without first the counter question, why did Jesus suffer? Why did God allow that? Now that might not lead you any more reliably than Job into getting intellectual answers to your questions, but it most certainly should lead you into a renewed relationship with the Lord, and that's what brought Job out of his misery. A footnote on wisdom. Chapter 28 is a hymn to wisdom. Its style makes it quite possible that it's by the same poet as wrote the main poem, but it's clearly out of place where it is. The fact is that it's there, and that contributes to locating Job within the Hebrew wisdom literature, of which we'll learn more when we come to the book of Proverbs. But verse 12 in chapter 28 is one that will live with me forever, because it takes me back to golden voice. That's what we called our voice coach in college. His job was to make sure that we knew how to use our speaking voices in order to be heard clearly. He didn't have much he needed to do with me in that direction, so we used to experiment with doing really awkward things, like in a large resonant building. But he always used this verse to do his own demonstrations of how to be heard. He'd stand at the back of the church and declaim, "But where shall wisdom be found?" He was a bit pompous. But he never did answer that question. But I think that Job has. And the answer is, shut up and get before the Lord. The theology of Job. What Job tells us about God is that he's sovereign and jealous of his sovereignty. Don't mess with him. Mind your P's and Q's when you're speaking to him. And somehow we need to combine that with the intense intimacy of coming to him as Abba. Knowing him as Father mustn't make us so pally with him that we forget that he's Lord of the universe. And what Job tells us about ourselves, that our relationship with the Lord is as important as our having clear information about him, or rather, more so. Bless you.